Hello, my name is Michael Montagna. I am a political science major here at Fairleigh Dickinson University, and I'd like to speak about Mr. Joseph Lenski. Our guest, Mr. Joseph Lenski, is a Princeton graduate. He has studied at the Annenberg School of Communication at the University of Pennsylvania, and Mr. Lenski's career started in the late 1980s as a statistical analyst. He then became an exit poll consultant in the 1990s, and in 2002, Mr. Lenski collaborated with CNN to design and operate CNN Real Vote, a vote gathering and election projection process, which is the essence of Mr. Lenski's work. He's an expert in the operation and organization of survey research and exit polling. He has been involved in every major exit poll conducted in the last decade. Mr. Lenski has exhibited his research in universities, on radio and television shows, and places such as Capitol Hill and the White House. He is also a former president of the New York chapter of the American Association for Public Opinion Research, where he and Dr. Woolley became acquaintances. In 1994, Mr. Lenski co-founded Edison Research with Larry Rosen. In the coming years, his New Jersey-based company would be recognized and respected as one of the leading market research and exit polling companies throughout the world. Every year, Mr. Lenski orchestrates hundreds of research projects which provide strategic information to radio and television shows, newspapers, cable networks, record labels, and internet companies, as well as sports franchises, government bodies, and several other media organizations. Because of the diligent work of Mr. Lenski and his company, Edison Research claims a 100% stake in the dissemination of exit poll information to the 6 major news organizations: ABC, CBS, CNN, Fox, NBC, and the Associated Press since the year of 2003. Edison has completed research projects in over 30 countries on practically every continent in the world. Their clients include companies and organizations such as Disney, CNN, Time Life, Google, Sony, The Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times. A quote from Mr. Lenski's research website regarding the 2008 presidential election will certainly put into perspective the difficulty of Mr. Lenski's work, and it also provide you with an idea of what he's here to speak about. The national exit poll for 2008 was one of the most logistically complex and challenging studies ever undertaken. With over 3,000 people conducting exit polls, reporting votes, and analyzing the results of over 100,000 election day interviews, it was certainly a difficult task. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Mr. Joseph Lenski.
Thank you. I hardly recognized myself in that introduction, but I'm so glad to see all of you here. This is a timely gathering. I was actually shared a plane ride with Peter earlier this year when we came back from the National APOR conference, and he suggested that I speak here, and I said, as long as it's after the election, because I'm a little too busy beforehand. This is actually good timing. As I was talking to Peter earlier, we're so busy preparing what we do on election day that I hardly have time to contemplate the data we gather. So this is actually a good opportunity for me to look back on some of the work we've done and share it with you. And I think learned a lot. Peter suggested this topic, and it's a good way to look across all the exit polls we've done since 2004 and see a bit of history in public opinion as it's been expressed by voters to us over the last 4 election cycles. So let me just do a brief history of Edison Research. Michael did a great job of explaining who we are and what we do, but one of the main projects we do is the national exit polls for the group called the National Election Pool, or NEP. Since 2003, Edison Research has been the sole provider of exit poll information that the national news organizations report. And since they write the questionnaires, but we put it into operation, we hire the people, we train the people, we collect the data on election night, process it so that they have data to talk about on election day and afterwards. Now, since they pay for it, they get to put their name on it. So what you see as a CNN exit poll or a Fox exit poll is their exit poll because they paid for it, but it was conducted by Edison Research. The first exit poll we did for them was in the California recall election in 2003, and we've covered every national election and series of primaries since. We also did the exit poll for the New York City mayor's race and the New Jersey governor's race last year. And just 2 weeks ago, we finished conducting the exit poll for the national congressional elections and the Senate elections around the country. Before I get into the data, I just thought I'd do a brief overview of the methodology of doing an exit poll, because an exit poll is different from many of the surveys that you see reported, many of the pre-election surveys and public opinion surveys that you see reported that are mainly done by telephone or online interviews, etc. The National Exit Poll is mainly in-person interviews of voters as they leave the polling place. This means that when we're talking to voters, we know they're voters. There's no likely voter model. There's no registered voter model. No, we just have a voter model. You just walk out of the polling place, we hand you a questionnaire, and you fill it out. And that's how we do it. So we know these voters have just voted because we've seen them walk out of the polling place. They fill out their questionnaire. It's fresh in their mind who they voted for, and we ask them why they voted that way. We also sample from the flow of crowd. Depending on the size of the polling place, we may interview every fourth or fifth person as they leave the polling place. So we have a random sample of voters at each of those polling places. We also can see the voters who refuse to participate in our surveys. And unfortunately, not everyone has the time or inclination to fill out one of our surveys. About 50% do, about 50% don't. But our interviewers can see whether it's a male or female that didn't fill out the exit poll, a young person or an older person, African American and non-African American. So we can actually adjust our results to the actual population of voters that has left the polling place. So again, we don't have to rely on census figures or other figures to weight this data. We know who the voters are as they left the polling place. The questionnaire that we administer is private and confidential. We hand it to the person, they fill it out themselves, they fold it up and put it in a ballot box for us to tabulate later. And I love this picture. I like showing this picture every time I talk. This is a picture actually from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. That's a voter in Georgia filling out one of our exit polls, and I just love it because it's vote here today, and she's taking her time and pondering very carefully her answers to our questions. Unfortunately, I don't think every voter we talk to is that serious about it, but I like using that picture as an example of the voters that fill out our questionnaires. As Michael said, this is a large one-day operation. The 2008 election was a little bigger because we covered all 50 states and the District of Columbia. For this election, we covered 876 polling places around the country. We interviewed more than 91,000 voters on Election Day. We processed 60,000 questionnaires of Election Day voters, and we also talked to 10,000 voters by telephone the week before the election of those who vote either by absentee ballot or at early voter locations. And about 30% of voters around the country now vote before Election Day, and we have to account for them in our surveys, and that's how we do that. So we ended up conducting full surveys in 26 states, all the main states that had Senate and governor's contests that were noteworthy, plus a national survey to make an estimate on vote for the U.S. House of Representatives. And that's the survey I'm going to talk about today. Here's an example of our questionnaire. It's 2 sides of 1 page, 5.5 by 8.5 inches, has about 15 to 20 questions. This is actually the New Jersey governor's election exit poll that we administered last year. So you can see we asked who you vote for governor, who you would have voted for if Chris Daggett weren't on the ballot, age, race, sex, income, party identification, and then some issues behind the campaign, whether economy or jobs, corruption was important in your vote, what type of characteristic you're looking for in the governor candidate you voted for. These are typical questions that we ask on an exit poll, and voters fill those out after they vote for us. And then all that information, those 91,000 questionnaires, are reported to us by phone or by PDA on election night because our clients are news organizations and they want to report the results to you as soon as the polls close on Election Day. So all that data that you see reported by CNN or Fox or ABC at 7 o'clock when the polls close or 8 o'clock when the polls close, that comes from our exit poll data. So Peter suggested as part of the series that I look at the questions we've asked on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the fight against terrorism and how that's been reflected in the exit polls we've conducted since 2004. And I'd never looked at this topic in one place before. So this was informative to me to look over time. Usually we're just looking at one election at a time and just seeing the story there. Here we actually have a story over 6 years of how this has progressed in terms of public opinion of voters. These are all the data you'll see that I'm presenting today is from our national exit polls. Again, these are surveys of between 12 and 18,000 actual voters, between 250 and 300 polling locations around the country in each election. As I said, the news organizations that we work with, the 6 news organizations form a committee and their polling directors are usually part of that committee, and that's the survey committee. They actually write the questions that go on the questionnaires that we administer. And their job, from their mandate from their managers, is to get the most newsworthy questions onto the questionnaires, the ones that journalists and pundits want to talk about on election night and that to reflect what the voters are interested in. What I thought was interesting, I went through the national questionnaire in each of these elections, and this was the number of questions asked on the topic of the economy in each election. And the economy is usually an important topic. In 2004, there were 7 questions about the economy. In 2006, 4. 2008, with the meltdown on Wall Street, was up to 7 questions. And then this year, 9 questions on the national exit poll were specifically asked about the economy. So that's kind of the journalist's opinion of what's important. Then I went back and said, how many questions were asked on our exit polls about the war in Iraq and Afghanistan and the war on terrorism? And interestingly, in 2004, more questions were asked on our exit poll about the war in Iraq and the war on terror than were asked about the economy. But we have seen every election since fewer and fewer questions are asked. And so that in 2010, we only asked 2 questions on the national exit poll questionnaire about one about the war, or actually both about the war in Afghanistan, and not even a single question about the war in Iraq, which was basically a non-issue in 2010. So I just thought looking at what we asked was informative. But one of the questions we almost always ask in the national exit poll is to voters, what is the most important issue facing the country? And as you see, in 2004, there were a whole bunch of issues kind of tied for the top spot. Moral values, the economy, terrorism, and the war in Iraq all had significant number of voters say that was the most important issue facing the country. But by 2008, with the recession, crash on Wall Street, the bailout, et cetera, the economy by far became the top issue. 63% said the economy was the top issue facing the country in 2008. War in Iraq fallen to 10%, fight against terrorism fallen to 9%. So you see less than half the number of people in 2008 said that either terrorism or the war in Iraq was the most important issue facing the country. So things had changed. And things are still there. The economy, again, the same 63% number told us in 2010 the economy is still the most important issue facing the country. The war in Iraq and terrorism wasn't even on the list, and the war in Afghanistan, only 7% said that was an issue that's actually been passed now by healthcare and illegal immigration in terms of the issues that voters think are most important. So I thought that was an interesting historical change. How did voters express that to us in each of these elections? Looking back in 2004, we asked the question, do you consider the war in Iraq to be part of the war on terrorism or separate from the war on terrorism? This is basically the divide in the argument between George Bush and the Democrats in terms of how the war in Iraq was initiated. And still in 2004, a majority of voters said the war in Iraq was part of the war on terrorism, 55% versus 42%. So at that time, it was war in Iraq and the fight against terrorism were seen as part of the same. And at that time, a majority felt safer from terrorism because of that. 54% said they, compared to 4 years ago, before 9/11, they felt safer from terrorism. 42% said they weren't. And this ties hand in hand with one of the main reasons George Bush held on to win that election. When we asked, who do you trust to fight terrorism, George Bush or John Kerry, George Bush had a significant edge over John Kerry in terms of the trust voters had in fighting the war on terrorism. 49% felt George Bush could handle that fight. Only 31% said John Kerry. 9% neither, 9% both. But that edge was the main reason that George Bush held on to win in 2004. But things soon changed after 2004. We asked in both the 2004 and 2006 exit polls, do you think that the war in Iraq has improved the long-term security of the United States? Again, a main argument of George Bush and the Republicans for pursuing the war in Iraq. And while it was fairly evenly split in 2004, even then, more people felt it wasn't in the long-term security interest of the United States to fight the war in Iraq. That number dropped 11% between 2004 and 2006. The opinions of the war had changed dramatically between 2004 and 2006, so much so that George Bush could win a re-election in 2004, but by 2006, riding the wave of discontent about the war in Iraq, Democrats won control of the House and the Senate. And this is one way we could say, this is the same question, asked the same sample of voters 2 years apart. We can see a dramatic change between 2004 and 2006. And overall support for the war in Iraq dropped dramatically after 2004. In 2004, we asked voters whether they approved or disapproved of the decision to go to war in Iraq. And a bare majority, 52%, said in 2004 they strongly or somewhat approved of the decision to go to war. That's actually 52% is pretty close to the 51% of the vote that George Bush got. So there's a direct correlation here between support for the war in Iraq and George Bush's re-election. 2 years later, support had dropped to 42%, and 4 years later, by 2008, support had dropped to 36%. And you also see here, my pointer here, strongly disapproved numbers, the people violently opposed to the war in Iraq, or vehemently opposed to the war in Iraq, had jumped dramatically, so 41% strongly disapproved of the conduct of the war in Iraq. Good thing you asked. I am prepared. So this is how those categories broke out. This is vote for House. Which party did you vote for in the congressional elections? Because we have that for both presidential and non-presidential elections. This is the 2004 breakout. As you can see, there's a strong correlation to partisanship and party vote in Congress based on this. Those that strongly approve of the war in Iraq were 89% voting Republican for House. Those strongly disapproved, 88%. And you can see when 52% are still supporting the war, that's enough for the Republicans to win. 2 years later, when this support drops to 42%, the crosstabs are the same. The partisanship within each group is about the same. 87% of those that strongly support the war are still voting Republican, and 87% of those strongly disapproving of the war are still voting Democrat. But this number has increased dramatically over 2 years. That's why the Democrats won control of the House and Senate in 2006. And then we asked the same breakout in 2008, and you can see the partisanship becomes even more intense. 92% of the strong supporters of the war vote Republican. 86% of those that strongly disapprove of the war voted Democrat. So that partisan division remained constant. It was just more people moved from approving the war in 2004 to disapproving of the war by 2008. And for we're approaching the year of the 10th anniversary of 9/11, and here we are, in 2004. How worried are you about another terrorist attack? We asked in 2008 the same question. How worried are you about another major terrorist attack in the United States? People were just as worried in 2008 as they were in 2004, and I think we saw the continuing war in Iraq did not do much to lessen voters' fears about a major terrorist attack, as George Bush and the Republicans had hoped when they pursued that policy. In 2006, going back 4 years ago, the main debate about the policy in Iraq was what to do next. Do we maintain the level of troops? Do we begin to withdraw? Or, as George Bush and John McCain were arguing, send more troops? So we asked this question during the election in November 2006. What should the U.S. do now? A majority of voters wanted to start withdrawing troops, either all the troops or some of the troops. 21% wanted to maintain the same number. Only 17% wanted to increase troops in Iraq. But what decision did George Bush make after the 2006 election? He supported the surge, sent more troops, and this is the reason why. 73% of those that supported sending more troops voted Republican. He was playing to the base, even though this was the fourth option out of four in terms of popularity among the voters. He actually went with the least popular option because it was supported by voters, Republican voters. Which brings us to our current situation. We asked, one of the two questions we asked about the war in Afghanistan on the exit poll is, how do you feel about the war in Afghanistan today? 54% of voters who voted on election day disapprove of the war. And among those that approve, interestingly, 75% of them voted Republican, even though that's basically the Obama policy to continue the war in Afghanistan. 61% of those that disapprove voted Democrat. It makes you wonder how much longer Barack Obama may pursue a policy that not only a majority of all Americans oppose, but a vast majority of Democrats oppose. So that's my to be determined part of this. So that's kind of the history and how the policy and how voters evolved in this process. And I'll happily take questions afterwards. I just wanted to end with a little coda, since I've been through so much to get the 2010 election done. I'm always asked, well, what happened? You know, what happened in this last election? And usually on election day, I'm too tired to actually look at this data. I'm up for 36 straight hours, making sure people show up, making sure data gets delivered, and then I crash and sleep for 15 straight hours afterwards. But this has given me an opportunity to look back. What actually happened in this election? And I think there's just a few points that summarize how voters responded in this election. One is what we talked about. As you saw earlier, 63% of voters thought both in 2008 and 2010 that the economy was by far the most important issue facing the country. Well, in 2008, those voters that thought the economy was the most important issue voted 55-43 for the Democrats. That was the margin of victory for the Democrats in 2008. This time, in 2010, they completely flipped, 54-43 voting for the Republicans. Again, they gave the Democrats a chance for 2 years to solve the economy. Now they're giving the Republicans a chance for 2 years to try to solve the economic problems. Even more dramatically is the fear and worry that voters have about the future economic situation. We asked, how worried are you about the direction of the economy in the next year? Not only what's happened, but the future of the economy. And even more dramatically, people who were worried about the economy in 2008 voted 60% for Democrats for Congress. In 2010, they completely flipped. 68% of those who worried about the direction of the national economy voted Republican. A dramatic change just in 2 years. Here's another group that is vitally important in national elections, and that's independent voters, those that neither associate with the Democrats or Republicans. And here we have several years' worth of data. In 2006, when the Democrats gained control, 57% of independents voted for Democrats for the House of Representatives. And that edge was still there in 2008, 51% voted for Democrats for Congress. This year, completely switched. 56% of independents voted Republican, only 37% of independents voted for the Democratic candidates for the House. That's why you saw such a dramatic turn from where Congress stood after the 2006 and 2008 elections, and a net gain of over 60 seats for the Republicans this year, all driven by independent voters who, again, had given the Democrats 4 years since 2006, Democrats in Congress 4 years since 2006 to put their mark on the economy, and now have turned to the Republicans. And finally, there's a group that I think we should look for in the future. While the Republicans won a dramatic victory, big gains for Republicans, a lot of their support is very tenuous. There's still memories among voters about the George Bush years and Republican control before 2006, and not a lot of approval of that. We asked in our exit poll, do you have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of the Democratic Party? And do you have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of the Republican Party? Well, guess what? They're unfavorable about both. And in fact, they're even more unfavorable about the Republicans. Interestingly, 53% have an unfavorable opinion about Republicans, 52% unfavorable about Democrats. Well, then how the hell did the Republicans win? They don't like either party. Well, fortunately, in our exit poll, we see a group that explains it. There's a group, 16%, that dislike both parties. And that group decided, it's hard to read here, but that group voted 68% Republican, 23% Democrat this time, even though they disliked the Republican Party as a brand. And that just goes to show how fed up this group was with the Democratic control of Congress, that even though they disliked Republicans, they were willing to vote for them to get their chance in power for the next 2 years. To me, that means if the Republicans don't produce something quickly, this group will go elsewhere. And what's interesting to me, if you look at this group, that 16% is very close to the 19% of the vote Ross Perot got in 1992 as an independent. This group, if you look demographically at them, looks very similar to Ross Perot voters. They're very concerned about the deficit. They're very concerned about spending. They're male. They're middle-aged. They're not poor, but they're frustrated about the economy. And so this is the group that Republicans better keep on their side, or they'll be back to where they were 2 years ago. So that's what I have to say, and I'll open it up for questions.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brittany Seychel, and I'll be facilitating the question and answer portion this evening. I'd like to begin by, I would say thank you on behalf of everyone for coming here today and speaking to us. It was very interesting, so thank you once again. And I will begin by asking the first question. I was wondering how news agencies use exit polls to, make calls on the outcome of elections before the polls are even closed, and if you think it has any effect on, late voters that maybe haven't even voted yet, but are hearing, calls on the news.
Okay, that's always a controversial topic when it comes to exit polling. People remember back in 1980 where exit polls were used to project Ronald Reagan, the winner over Jimmy Carter, before the polls were closed in California. And Jimmy Carter even came out and conceded before the polls were closed in California. And there's a lot of bitterness, especially in Western states, about that. Let me just tell you what our clients do now, based on all that. The 6 news organizations that I represent have an agreement with Congress. They will not report any exit poll results that characterize the winner in a race until all the polls in that state have closed. So you will see no exit poll information about New Jersey until 8 o'clock. You'll see no information about Texas until 9 o'clock. You'll see no information about California until 11 o'clock. That's the promise they've made to Congress. And they've also proposed a uniform poll closing time where all polls close at the same time. But until that happens, votes get counted while the polls are still open in California. So as soon as the polls close, they will report the results. What we've also done is, because our exit poll data gets shared with journalists at news organizations before the polls close, since 2004, since the internet started leaking some of our data before the polls were closed, we've started in 2006 what we call a quarantine room. That means any analysts that have access to exit poll data before 5 o'clock are in a room where they have to give up their cell phone, give up their pager, give up their laptop. They have no access to the outside world except the exit poll data. And they cannot share that data with anyone, even in their own news organizations, until after 5 o'clock in the afternoon. We actually got that idea. They've been doing this for years in Great Britain for the the UK exit polls. And the reason they did it in England for years had nothing to do with the internet. They did it because these journalists would actually take the information and call their bookies and make bets based on the information. So that's why they instituted it. But the quarantine works well for us. We've had no leaks of information before 5 o'clock since we implemented that.
Thank you very much.
When you asked voters to tell what was the most important issue in an election, were they asked to write the answer in, or was it a list that they chose from?
They were given a list. And as you saw when I showed the questionnaire, to process this much data in one day, we cannot use what are quote, open-ended or verbatim responses. They're all multiple choice questions. But in crafting that question, all of the news organizations ask open-ended questions similar to that on their telephone polls, and we typically put the top 4 or 5 issues that people volunteer in those pre-election polls on our exit poll questionnaire. So while the questionnaire itself is not a volunteered response or a verbatim response, we usually base the list that we put on pre-election surveys that use open-ended questions.
Younger people were less likely to vote this year than 2 years ago. Blacks and Hispanics were less likely to vote this year than 2 years ago. Some Democrats were less likely to vote this year than 2 years ago. In fact, one of the questions we asked from the exit polls, who did you vote for 2 years ago? And among the group that voted in 2010, it was 45% Obama, 45% McCain. So if this group of voters, this 90 million, had voted in the presidential election, it would have been a really close race. The other 40 million were the ones that made the difference for Obama. So that is the type of question that political analysts will look at our data, the parties look at our data. The next day I'll get a call from the Democratic National Committee and the Republican National Committee. Where can I get your data? We need to start studying for 2012, who voted, why they voted, et cetera. The parties will look at this data, and the key component to 2012 for the Obama campaign is how do we get those 40 million people to come back and vote in a presidential election that didn't vote in the congressional election.
Next question's over here.
Thank you for the very enlightening speech. I found especially enlightening that graph at the end where you sort of point out the people who don't like both parties. And I'm wondering if this...
Are you in that group?
I'm no comment. I'm wondering how much overlap, it's maybe more of an analysis question, I'm sorry if it is, but how much overlap that group has with the whole Ron Paul revolution, libertarian sort of grassroots movement that much was ado about, but very little came of back during the election?
Yeah, I don't know for sure because we didn't ask any questions about Ron Paul in this. We did ask a few Tea Party questions, but the Tea Party now is moved on beyond, I think, the group you were referring to. All I can say is demographically, they look similar to those types of people. They're 57% male, they're mostly 45 to 59-year-olds, they're mostly middle to upper middle class, small business people or folks like that. So in terms of their demographic profile, they look like that group, but I just don't know. We didn't ask the questions to determine if they really are Ron Paul supporters or libertarian type philosophy, but I'm sure they're part of it.
How are you going to account for households that are phasing out landlines? What do you plan to do?
Very good question. Anyone who's followed telephone poll methodology over the last few years knows that more and more people have unplugged. I mean, how many of you, the only way I can call you is through your cell phone? Yeah. So it's gotten to the point, it's about 22% of adults now you can only get through their cell phone. There's no landline phone. And for years, polling was done through landline phones. And there's actually regulations. Those of you that do polling know the regulations. You can use automated dialers to call a landline. You cannot use computer or automated dialers to call a cell phone. You have to have the hand dial, and you have to have a human operator talk to people to conduct a survey over the cell phone. And a lot of work, a lot of investigation over the last 4 to 6 years on that. This year, for the first time, for the telephone polls that I mentioned of early voters, we included a segment to represent the cell phone sample. And so we did include them in our surveys of early voters in terms of the telephone interviews we conducted. We also asked a question on the national survey, whether you have a cell phone, whether you have a landline, so we could look of voters that we talked to on election day, how many of them we only could have contacted through a cell phone. And it's about 21% of the voters we talked to on election day can only now be contacted through a cell phone. So we're very conscious of that. There are additional costs, there are additional complications of doing it, but I think we've reached the point where more than 20% of voters can only be contacted that way. That has to be part of the survey process.
Next question's over here.
Yes, in the 2004 presidential election between Kerry and Bush, wasn't there a conflict in the exit polls, especially in Ohio, that showed Kerry was going to win that night?
Yeah, it is a controversy that shouldn't be a controversy. Exit polls are surveys. Exit polls are surveys like any other survey. There's sampling error, there's other non-response bias, and we will never project a winner unless we're 99.5% confident statistically that the margins will hold. And while indeed the early vote returns, the early exit poll returns from Ohio showed Kerry winning by 2 or 3 points and Bush ended up winning by about 3 points, that is sampling error. That's survey error. No one, you can go through all the transcripts, no one ever reported on CNN or Fox or ABC that John Kerry had won Ohio. All this is done based on bloggers looking at early returns and saying, oh, Kerry's winning by 2 points, he's got to win. Sorry, it's a survey, like any other survey has a margin of error. So all I can say is when we use this data, we know its limitations in terms of projecting results, and we know a 2-point margin in an exit poll is not enough to be confident of projecting a race.
I was wondering, how do you account for the absentee ballots?
Yeah, as I said, we ended up talking to over 10,000 voters by telephone the week before the election. Usually in the states with high proportion of early voters, that's how we do most of the interviews. I don't know how many of you know that now there are states like Oregon and Washington that are entirely by mail. There's not a polling. The only thing you can do on election day is drop your ballot off at the election office. It's all done by mail. So there's no poll to exit poll act.
But the questionnaire is still the same.
Questionnaire it was the same questions. It has to be adjusted a little bit because it's being done over the phone. So the wordings might be changed slightly because they can't see the questionnaire as they're being asked it. But it's basically the same questions are asked on the phone that are asked on election day.
Next question's over here as well.
How do you handle expats and military?
We don't. I mean, they're not covered. If they're not in the United States, we cannot survey them. So that is a lack of coverage. In most states, that's a small enough proportion that they don't affect the outcome. If it's a state like Florida in 2000, overseas voters, especially military voters, could affect the outcome. But again, as I said earlier, if we're talking about margins that are 0.5% or whatever, where those ballots would come into play, we wouldn't make a projection based on our exit polls anyway.
I'm curious about, in the chart you showed with the economy, you said you asked 9 questions in 2010 about the economy, and that was obviously the main priority for most of voters. And then you talked about the war in Afghanistan, which was, at the bottom of 7%. I'm interested in what the correlation was, like what kind of economic questions were asked. We're spending billions of dollars overseas on these wars. Did that have any correlation with the questions that were asked about the economy?
We asked questions about approval or disapproval of the stimulus plan. So what percent of voters approved or disapproved of the stimulus and how they voted. We asked about what voters think should be done about the Bush tax cuts, whether they should be allowed to expire, or they should be extended. So many of the questions that are the economic points of debate right now, we asked the question I showed earlier, how worried are you about the economy? Do you have someone in your household that has lost their job or been laid off? is your family's financial situation better or worse now than it was 2 years ago? So a lot of detailed questions, both about voters' own financial situation, but also about their opinions about the issues that are going to be debated in the next Congress.
How do the responses line up? Are they skewed, or do they line up with the in-person responses?
You mean in terms of how people vote?
Yes.
Back 10, 20 years ago, when fewer people voted absentee, typically absentee voters were older people, people that traveled, people who were out of town, and they tended to be more Republican, higher income Republican voters. Now, because there's no excuse early voting in a lot of places, and because a lot of Democratic groups have become interested in mobilizing voters, especially in states like Florida and Ohio, where Democrats were contentious of previous elections and felt they've been discriminated against in terms of early election day voting. The Democratic Party has really pursued getting their people to vote early. A couple of really good examples in Iowa in 2008. Obama beat McCain by 15 to 20 points among early voters, but actually was tied with McCain on election day voters. And that was all from Democratic mobilization to get that absentee ballot, vote early, put that vote in the bank, so we don't have to worry about calling you on election day and making sure you come to the polls. So there are several states now where Democrats make a really big push. It's also one of the reasons I think Harry Reid ended up winning in Nevada when the polls said that it was even, or even he may have been behind, is because I think he had a really good organization to get his voters to vote absentee or early in Nevada. Unions play a part in that too, and unions are big in Nevada, big supporters of Harry Reid, so I think that was a big help for him there.
Do you contract with other parties to have kind of add-on questions, or, you know, or are your clients only the 6 News broadcasters for this exercise?
It depends on the election. For the general elections, we are only doing it for the 6 news organizations are our clients. They write the questionnaires. We do sell subscriptions to the exit poll, so the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post can get the data as well for a subscription fee, but they don't have any input into the actual questions on the questionnaire. Now, on other elections, like I mentioned, the New York City mayor's race, we did that last year just for the New York Times. The New York Times hired us, they wrote the questionnaire, we fielded for them. The national news organizations weren't as interested in what they saw as a local election, the New York City mayor's race. So if there's a specific local election, we have clients of all types, but for the national general election, it's the 6 news organizations.
Could that include a commercial or a partisan political client?
As long as it's not on the same day that we're doing an exit poll for one of the news organizations. In fact, we also do international exit polling. I was talking to Peter earlier in May. We were actually contracted to go to Tbilisi, Georgia, former Soviet Republic of Georgia, to do an exit poll for the mayor's race there. And so I spent 10 days in Tbilisi, Georgia, overseeing the operation of the exit poll there.
Could you comment a little more in detail on how you arrived at the questions for each questionnaire? I mean, what's the process for that? Because I think that's very important.
Yeah, it's a very exhaustive process. What happens is starting in late August, early September, it's usually the polling director or the polling director's representative from each of the 6 news organizations begins to meet. We meet about 4 times in person and do about 6 or 7 conference calls where the 6 of them suggest questions, debate questions, tweak the wording of questions, vote on what questions should be on, what questions shouldn't be off. It's a very intensive process with a lot of input from all 6 news organizations. But in the end, it's the 6 members of that committee that decide what questions are asked, how they're asked, who they're asked to.
Next question's over here.
I'm interested in how you choose your pollsters. Do you try to get them to all be the same age or look alike or something like that?
No, I mean, typically we want to make sure they're well trained, they follow the procedures. We do study how people respond to different types of interviewers. It seems that younger interviewers tend to have a tougher time having older voters respond to them. So we try, in most cases, to hire older voters, but a lot of times older interviewers aren't available in every location. But the older the interviewer, usually we get a higher response rate because younger people tend to respond, whether it's a young person or old person. Older people tend to be a little more dubious, unfortunately, of younger people. I don't know why that's the case, but that's the case. But basically, we train, we evaluate interviewers if we find we can compare the results in each precinct from the survey, from the actual votes that are recorded in each precinct. If we find interviewers that do not get accurate responses or do not follow the rules, then they're not hired back next time. So we do weed out based on the actual performance interviewers for the next election.
Did you have an exit polling in Alaska and Murkowski?
Not this year. There was a lot of debate on that. In the end, I mean, there was a limited number of resources. 26 states were picked. One of the main reasons Alaska wasn't done is because we knew it would take 3 weeks to actually count the votes. And to report on an election that hasn't been finished is a tough thing to do. We did do an exit poll in Alaska in 2008 for the Stevens re-election for Senate. And again, we showed a really close race, and that's all we could say. And it took, again, in that case, 2 or 3 weeks for the results to be there. And I think that experience affected the news organization to say, let's exit poll a state where we know we can get the results that night. Alaska also, the polls don't close until 1 in the morning on the East Coast. And I know a lot of you were up all night, like I was, watching the election results, but most viewers have gone to bed before 1 o'clock. So that's the reason Alaska didn't pick up this time.
Are there any other questions? No? All right, I'd like to thank you on behalf of everyone for coming here today.